So we want to bring two other people into this conversation and talk about car pride. Do we still need our car? For some people, cars are used as a form of expression like fashion, but for others, they simply bring us to A to B, and there's little or no emotional attachment. Well, here to talk about these two sides of the coin, I'd like to welcome Dr. Andreas Neenhaus. He is the Mobility Forum Leader at Oliver Wyman. A warm welcome to you. And a warm welcome to Rebecca Flynn. She is researching the subject of car pride at the London School of Economics. And once again, we have Boyd Cohen, the CEO of Iomob. So Rebecca, I want to get started with you. Boyd just told us that the future of mobility will be multimodal, but there is a small problem, and that is that people just love their cars, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we've sort of been looking at in our project. So we're sort of running this project with researchers at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. And the sort of crux of the problem that we're looking at is that over the past decades even, we're seeing that in cities, car use is becoming much more expensive. It's becoming less convenient as cities introduce modal filters and car access restrictions. And also at the same time, public transport provisions and alternatives to cars are becoming much more accessible, available, they're becoming cheaper, more comfortable. But at the same time, we're seeing really sort of persistent levels of car ownership. For example, in London, still 56% of households have access to a car. And when you look at outer London in isolation, this rises to 68%. And in Zurich, it's similar. I think over a third of residents in Zurich actually own a car. So these are pretty high levels. And what we're coming to understand is it's not only the practical reasons that people are choosing to drive. It's also the sort of more emotional reasons and the huge significance of car as a sort of cultural object insofar as it sort of conveys different status considerations in a way that maybe other modes of transport haven't quite yet caught up with. And it's, I guess we're now in a situation where cities need to develop strategies to combat this car culture and sort of, create different sort of cultures and more sustainable alternatives.
Andreas, I want to bring you into the conversation. You've carried out extensive research at Oliver Wyman in the last couple of months. What are the trends in mobility right now?
I think there's this, of course, overarching trend of Corona, who's impacting the way how we get from A to B and how people, want to get from A to B. Before Corona, we had this acceleration of transformation in mobility. People, use exactly like Boyd just said, multimodals. They were ambitious to, share their form of mobility. It was just about getting from A to B in an efficient and convenient way. We saw, at least in the research we did during the pandemic, that people significantly valued security and individuality of their travel mode, right? So, and this kind of translated into some sort of lock-in effect of the car itself. We hope it's not, sustaining, but somebody who's buying a car in the pandemic to avoid, the risk of the pandemic on public transport, he will most likely not just abandon the vehicle because it's an investment after a couple of weeks or months. Yeah? So we see some sort of lock-in for the personal vehicle on the one side. On the other side, we also see the pandemic as a real accelerator for a comprehensive city-based mobility concept, right? The regulators during the pandemic, they stepped into our lives and they really controlled how we got from A to B, or if we were allowed to leave our homes, right? That's a completely new story we weren't, at least in Europe or the States, used to, right? And they will not move back to a completely passive position. The regulators, they will stay in some sort of regulating and also conceptualizing the mobility within the city or within a certain area, right? And this will also hopefully kind of change the hierarchy of the modes in the city, coming from the vehicle, the most important form of transportation historically, now shifting for bikes, for walking, and so on. But it's kind of in the shift right now. Coming back to your question, we had a path towards transformation of mobility, at least in urban areas. We saw some sort of backlash to private mobility based on security reasons and just based on the pandemic. And we hope to get back on the track towards intermodal, shared, and just basically more convenient and more efficient mobility in the future.
So Boyd, it hasn't been easy for mobility as a service in the last couple of years. Why is that, or is it simply related to the fact that it's such a fragmented approach?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate in our industry regarding the viability of mobility as a service, how well it's being adopted so far, where's the profit, what's the right business model, what's the role of government and versus the private sector in deploying them. Is mobility as a service going to be adopted more as a subscription model or as a pay-as-you-go? And there's a lot of unanswered questions right now, to be honest. I like to say, we're still in the very early days of this. I mean, we're just seeing all this explosion of new forms of mobility and all this fragmentation. We're seeing, massive focus on climate change right now. We're seeing changing regulations. Amsterdam recently, just in the last year or so, started reducing a lot more of the parking space available in urban core areas. We're seeing a growth of road user charging. All these things are trying to get people out of their cars, and we're going to need that. We're going to need this carrot and stick because a lot of people do love their car, as Rebecca has said. And in many cases, the user experience for driving a car is better than the alternative. And so what MaaS is about is making the alternative as good or better in terms of price, efficiency, quality, and experience. And that's not easy because you're trying to, as a MaaS tech platform like us, you're trying to align an entire ecosystem, many of whom do not have a history of collaborating very much. The large behemoth venture capital backed US companies want to dominate and own the user. And that doesn't always go well with a MaaS model where the idea is to present the best options for the user and let them make the best choice for them. And then the operator might lose some control or ownership over that user. So there's a lot of hurdles to overcome here. And then, just like any new technology or service, it takes a while to get adoption and let alone getting profitability. I mean, we all forget about it now, but we probably should. Uber, which is this ubiquitous company that almost everyone watching this has an Uber app on their phone. It wasn't always like that. And the second highest expense in Uber annually is customer acquisition, and it's in the billions. I think 2019 was like $3 billion spent on customer acquisition. So I think MaaS will get there. I think we're going to see successful deployments that are B2C, that go direct to customer. And I think we're going to see plenty of successful enterprise approaches, whether that's OEMs launching MaaS platforms, whether it's existing large transport operators, rail operators, even airlines. You're going to see a growth in the use of MaaS for corporate and employee mobility. So it's coming. We have this great advisor. He used to be the head of strategy worldwide for Amazon. His name is Adam Chassin. And a couple months ago, he said, whenever I look at a company or an industry, the first thing I ask myself is, in 20 years from now, will this be a big thing or will this be gone? Is this just a fad? And he said 20 years from now, on a scale of 0 to 10, the likelihood that multimodal mobility will be ubiquitous in 20 years is a 10. Like, there's no way the market will remain as fragmented as it is without any way to connect it. So it'll last. It's just taking us a while to get there.
Okay, thank you for that. Rebecca, I want to talk about the other side of the coin, and I want to ask you, what does the car mean to its owner, and has that changed over the last few years? Is it still the status symbol that it once was?
I mean, I think the success of the automotive industry for the past maybe 70 years has been to create the car into this object that's actually many things to many different owners. I mean, and that's, I guess, that's also where the strength of the multimodality can come in, because, it can target different consumer groups in a way that sort of, the automotive industry offer the one product and market it in different ways, whereas multimodality can come at different angles with different sort of modes. But I do think that it's almost when you're looking at the sort of opposition to the reduction in car use, you shouldn't necessarily always look at the breadth of opposition to car use restrictions, but it's just the strength of this opposition is so striking. Recently, in response to the pandemic in London and with many other cities, London's been accelerating vehicle access restriction measures that had already been in the pipeline, but they've just been able to accelerate it due to COVID. And the strength of the opposition to that has been just really staggering. I mean, just lots and lots of protests and even, vandalism of modal filters. And even in one case, a local councillor received death threats due to these measures. And in response, local politicians who are operating under short-term election timeframes came under immense pressure, and in a few cases they've been rolled back. So I think, while more and more people are sort of adopting these new options, the sort of strength of opposition sort of remains, and it's the level of opposition rather than the breadth, because what we're seeing is actually, whenever you look at opinion polls across the city as a whole, the majority seem to be in favour of a reduction in car ownership and a move to a more sustainable mobility future. But it's just, it's as Boyd said, it's not whether or not we will get there. We will get there. It's just how antagonistic the journey will be, and what cities can do to sort of make that a less antagonistic process.
Andreas, interestingly, the used car market is growing and growing. What is the reason for that?
I mean, the used car market, in particular the online used car market, is exploding right now. And this is because we have different trends from, based on customer sentiment coming together. On the one side, as I mentioned earlier, people are interested in individual secure mobility, and that's the personal vehicle. On the other side, they also have lack of long-term financial security in some cases based on the pandemic, right? Job insecurity and so on, economic insecurity. And these two components bringing together are the used car market. And then if I don't want to leave the house, or if I can't leave the house to actually go to the dealership, or I don't have any interest to go to the dealership, then I'm at the online used car market. And that's kind of a sweet spot right now where we see a lot of movement, a lot of growth happening, and talking to online used car dealers, they simply don't know where to get the cars from. And there are recent news and headlines in the States that used cars are getting more expensive than the traditional list prices for new cars, right? So it's maybe only a period in time where we see this acceleration of used car demand. Hopefully coming back to a more integrated intermodal mobility preference of the end user. But right now, this is based on these different underlying consumer sentiments coming together.
So, Boyd, I want to ask you, in your opinion, what is the tipping point? I mean, it doesn't seem to be the cost, because as we know, a car is an expensive purchase, and as we heard twice before today, it's only used 4% of the time.
So, I think both Andreas and Rebecca have touched on something that I think is like an unspoken element of this session, which starts with the way it was established as car pride versus MaaS. And I think that's a false dichotomy, actually. We have this problem in MaaS that, in my opinion, that many of the protagonists of MaaS have set up MaaS as a direct alternative and a contributor to this anti-car, pro-car dynamic. You either embrace multimodality or you love your car. There's no middle ground. But almost nothing in life is black and white, and I can promise you it's not black and white that every person who owns a car always wants to be in their car and never wants to take any other form of mobility. Many people hate being in 3 hours of traffic. And when there are 3 hours of traffic, they're looking for the escape route. Get me out of this. I want a train. So what I think is, if we move away from that false dichotomy, I think we're already starting to experience MaaS in different ways, whether it's called that or not. Again, my point from earlier in the session, how many people today use a park and ride? That's a form of MaaS, even if it's currently disconnected right now. And I will say that a lot of the people in the MaaS world have painted MaaS, in my opinion, falsely to be about moving people without a car. And I think what MaaS is, or if you will, you can call it mobility on demand, is about tapping in to all of the vehicles in the world, public, private, shared. There's more than, what, 1.5 billion vehicles on the ground today. Making them seamlessly accessible to people, even their own car, like Link spoke about before, in peer-to-peer car sharing or in carpooling, making these vehicles available in a way where we optimize their utilization in cities so we reduce congestion, reduce our impact on climate, and get people to more sustainable forms of mobility, whether that's an electric vehicle or shared mobility or whatever that is. But it's about making all these options seamlessly accessible and available to people so that they can make the best choice for them, which sometimes might be their own car or someone else's. And real quick, going back to the topic of used cars, we've been in talks with OEMs and car dealerships who are now seeing the future of multimodality as well and saying, we've got this real estate and we've got this asset sitting around, these used cars that might take weeks or months to sell. Can we insert those into a platform like Iomob and make them accessible for short-term rentals as a new form of car rental or car sharing so we can optimize their utility and our revenue from them? Maybe somebody who rents one for 3 days will choose to buy it. Who knows? If not, at least we're monetizing them while they're on our fleet. So what I'm trying to say is we're going, like Link was a great presentation because it's about challenging our current paradigms about how we think about what our car is to us and who can use it. As we move to peer-to-peer and seamless interaction between sharing of services and vehicles, cars will be part of the mix, and that's fine.
Rebecca, I want to ask, according to your findings, what role does cost play?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. We're finding that people will say that cost is important. But when you look at it, whenever you look at the sort of trend of cost increasing and the levels of car ownership not decreasing in the same way, it seems like there's more to that. And the reason for this, we think, is that because a lot of the emotional reasons for car ownership, people won't really admit them, or they don't know that they have them. You know, people are unlikely to say, I drive this certain type of car because it fits in with my vision of masculinity, et cetera, et cetera. You know, it's probably not even something that they're consciously aware of. So I would say cost is important in getting people to use cars less. But we need to sort of act in many different fronts, and it's not the only front that we need to address. And I think, the culture of car ownership is one of those sort of lesser addressed issues that I think needs to come to the fore a bit more.
Andreas, what is your prediction for the future on this matter? Will more and more people be able to let go of their cars?
Well, I think there's definitely light at the end of the tunnel, so to say. We did a survey across 7 countries, 5,000 end users, and on the one side, they were very, they were not as connected to their personal vehicle anymore, and they said if for instance, the in-vehicle infotainment, if that doesn't allow me to feature my mobile device, my apps I'm using outside the vehicle, 80% of them are willing to change car brands or the model, right? So the connection to the personal vehicle is kind of deteriorating over time. In addition to that, we see that especially younger people, they don't value the ownership anymore, right? And looking at company car programs, 10, 15 years ago, almost every new hire was very eager to get a company car. Right now, 1 out of 10 is actually using a company car. Obviously, employees of automakers are an exception, but generally speaking, this is something where you can really see that ownership instead of usership is gaining in importance. And if you ask, what are my buying criteria of a car? It's not so much about status symbol anymore. It's not so much about power and so on. It's getting from horsepower to bytes, right, and to integration into my overall digital life. So I really think we are getting more in a direction where usership is, the primary source of decision making there.
Boyd, I want to ask you, what are you most excited about in the near future, not only in Barcelona, but perhaps also in the United States?
Wow. Certainly, speaking of cars, very excited about the sort of growing interest in electric vehicles. And actually, if you talk about car pride, I think you're starting to see more car pride from electric vehicle owners than any other type of vehicle, less than whether it's a luxury vehicle. It's now more of a status symbol to have an electric car. That by itself is a major, I mean, we might not realize it now, but 10 years ago, that was not the case. And now it's become sexy and cool to own an electric car. That's a great starting point. I think, as Andreas mentioned, the whole embracing of the sharing economy has certainly penetrated big time the younger generation, and that is starting to impact significantly their mobility behavior. I think, you know, even the connected car is really interesting, because I think we're going to see some really exciting things emerge out of the connected car that connects back into multimodality, whether that's around sharing your car for peer-to-peer car sharing or carpooling, whether that's around, you know, booking a first and last mile or a parking space in your vehicle. So those things will actually also contribute to the car not being a dichotomous negative thing for multimodality. I think, you know, in Europe, one thing we talked about COVID, I think what's been exciting is that it became a stimulant for dialogue and action and policy around more active travel in cities, and how can we get people out of cars and using more active travel corridors, removing lanes. You talked about Barcelona. Barcelona's become kind of famous for some things like Paris in terms of trying to take away streets from cars and shift them to pedestrian and green space. So I think the trends are going in the right direction in terms of us accelerating our path to more sustainable mobility. And I'll end with this. I've been in the sustainability and climate arena for a very long time, literally 20 years. I wrote a book called Climate Capitalism that was published 10 years ago, 2011. Today is the most prevalent. We are seeing dialogue about climate change and climate action in every community, whether it's public policy, corporates, customers. And I think that's going to help accelerate a more sustainable path too, as we raise our global consciousness. Our regulations move in the right direction, and companies do too.
I know you mentioned earlier before about Paris banning some short-haul flights, and I think it's also interesting to note that on Monday, I believe it was this past Monday, that in Paris, in most streets, you can only drive at 30 kilometers an hour, so it is indeed a step in the right direction. Rebecca, I want to ask you, what is perhaps one of the most surprising things that you've come across in your research?
One of the most surprising things, I guess maybe it is just the sort of the persistent levels of car ownership in outer areas of cities, which I guess will hopefully come down at some point. But yeah, I guess it's also sort of, you know, when looking at the strength of the advertising for decades and decades and decades, it's really not surprising that we're running into this problem of I guess cultural attachments to cars. But yeah, it's something, it's as well as something I think that, you know, we could address through different participatory modes of governance. And like Boyd said, I mean, now is the moment where we're seeing a huge discussion on climate transitions. And one thing that's been really, really successful at the local government level in many countries, and particularly here in the UK, has been citizens' assemblies on climate transitions. And I believe that if they were sort of held more citizens' assemblies at the sort of residential areas on mobility transformations, that could be really something that could help to sort of help, I guess, ease some of the antagonism towards repurposing road space away from cars and towards different alternatives.
Okay, thanks. I want to ask Andreas, what role can car sharing models play, like the one that we heard from Alain Vizet from Link & Co? Do you think that's the future, or do you think it's just fiction?
No, it's definitely exciting, and it's part of the future, and it will be a very dominant part of the future, I think. And the role of car sharing itself, it will evolve, and it's constantly evolving. If I think back 10, 15 years ago, when we helped OEMs set up their first car sharing platform, or car sharing, not really a platform, but car sharing service, they really thought about, okay, one car that is shared and offered by me as a car sharing, that will substitute 10 cars I'm selling to end customers. In fact, it turned out it's rather the other way, right? If you use car sharing and promote it to especially the younger end user group, they are more willing to, or more inclined to actually buy your product, right? So there was a completely shift in perception from the people who make the car on what does it imply to have car sharing in the market. And I think it will shift again over time once we get closer and closer to the real end game, which is shared autonomy, right? Everybody's working towards shared autonomy, and car sharing is a very exciting and important step towards that end game, but it is a step, right? You don't really solve the overall problem that you get rid of the vehicle within inner cities. You still have to find a parking spot or, charge or whatever, right? But it's an important intermediate step towards this shared mobility, shared autonomous end game. And it's definitely an improvement from the status quo.
All right, that brings us to the end of our panel. I would like to thank Boyd, Andreas, and Rebecca. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are going to take a very short little break, but don't go away. We'll be back in about 8 minutes. See you then.